Dad started work at the sugar mill when he was 14, 1930, and retired in 1981. Dad started, down the bottom, and then he worked his way up through fireman and loco driver in the steam loco days. By the time dieselisation come in, Dad was actually running the tramline system. Those were the days when you could actually go to work with Dad and, health and safety didn't come into it. You had enough common sense not to get run over with a loco or something. So, you grew up around them. My dad's job, by the time I'd grown up a bit, entailed working best part of 7 days a week for 6 months of the year when the crushing was on. So the best chance to get to hang around with Dad was to go to work with him and help him. And if I helped him, count empty cane trucks, for instance, on a Sunday, that means he could go home early enough and we could go to the beach. It was like a living thing, the sugar mill, especially at night when you could see all the steam and stuff. And there was always plenty of movement. It wasn't just noise, there was plenty of movement all the time.
They first started out up towards Burnside and Perwillowen. The line was built round the bends and cut out and built up to where the present lookout is at Dulong. In 1905 there were Russian Finns growing cane up there, and the little town was named Finbury. But in those days the line was only built up to the cliffs below the present Dulong lookout. They got their first trams about 1905. The first one I think the mill bought was called the Moreton. Then they bought the Shay that used to climb the ranges to Mapleton. My uncle Tom was one of their main loco drivers. He was so interested in steam that he built his own steam engine at 10 years of age. He actually shed tears when the Moreton Mill told him that they were giving away steam to go into diesel.
The first piece I'm quite familiar with because that was the sugar mill piece, and I've got the original survey for that. It's just over 4 mile long. That took you up to Dulong. When the people of Mapleton saw how well it serviced the farms at Dulong, they wanted to extend it. But the mill, after a few years of operation, and the mill had started to expand eastward down Petrie Creek, no cane expansion occurred beyond Dulong, so there was no reason for the sugar mill to finance a line up to Mapleton. They were in the business of crushing sugar cane, not general carrier. So the council decided they would take it on and buy the mill's bit of line. They would still use the locos to bring whatever cane down as well. And that worked quite well up until, 1940. I don't think it ever made a profit, but it served a community need. At that point in time, it was, very significant because, you could get your product, more or less down to town same day and onto a train to Brisbane. It was steep climb and tight curves, and that's why they needed the Shays, because the Shays are not like any of the other locos. The Shay's got a chassis a bit like a truck. It's a flexible sort of chassis. It's got bogie drives underneath, and they're all geared, and so it's very slow, and it's got a lot of wearing parts because it's got all these gears. And they're made for pretty rough track, laid in the hills of America for logging. And when it come to restoring the Shay at the museum, some missing handles and things like that, I didn't need drawings or anything to replace them. I could replace them out of my head as to what they did and what they would look like, So it comes in handy playing on trains. We used to call them flat tops and you used them at the mill to carry any sort of thing, to do repairs to tracks and bridges. So when it come to time to go run an excursion, I think they had a few sort of dedicated to the job, but if they needed extra ones, it'd be just a matter of sitting something like a school form basically with a bit of a backrest they had made up, and they'd put them on and probably only tie them on with a piece of rope or something, and everyone would sit on them. And I don't ever remember anyone getting majorly hurt, so a lot more common sense in those days. But they were really serviceable little trucks, but the ones up there were bigger, and they also had a different deck on them. They were like a slatted sort of deck, which made them easy to convert into little seating ones. You'll see on the picnic excursions up to Mapleton, they were only quite small cane trucks converted to seats, so they'd just have these little forms sat on them, you know.
I lived at Mapleton and I came up there 12-year-old. I've been up there ever since, and I'm 90 in September. It was very quiet. Just a butcher shop there, the Mapleton Hotel and the main store, Masonic Lodge and the hall. Beautiful farms up there of navel oranges. A big timber mill was there, which is not there now. They loaded up with kegs of beer, groceries, anything wanted, and they'd drop it off on the way to Nambour to all the farms. They'd leave at 8:30 or 9, go down to the mill, go round the mill, come across the road, the Licia Road, through the park up there now, and all round the mountains. There's Lantana Road on the left, just going to Nambour, just down the first hill. Well, the tram used to go across just down from there, the tram line, all round the hills, and it'd take all this stuff down. They'd bring them in of a morning, and they had a siding. They'd load all these cases of navel oranges on for the tram, and they took the timber down to Nambour, the cans of cream, and any fruit and that sort of thing. And it went round to Nambour, down the back of the railway station. There used to be a big fruit shed. They used to load it off there and then load it onto the train and used to go to Brisbane. And then on the way back, they'd bring things back like kegs of beer or things for the shop, and it'd come back about 3 or 4 o'clock. On the way down, I lived only about 5 minutes walk across the paddock to where the train go, and every morning at 9 o'clock he'd blow his whistle before he got there, and I was about 14. The woman next door, she'd get me to run over with his lunch or morning tea, so I'd run across there and he'd slow the tram down and take his lunch out of a brown paper packet, and off he'd go. And I'd done that for years. His name was Bill English, and the first driver, I believe, was Jock Simpson. He had it first. Then Billy English took it on. I don't know what year it was. We never worried about the years. And then when he retired, his son Bill took over, and he drove it for years, and he was the last, I believe. If we do anything, it must be such and such a time that you can hear the tram coming. Anyway, this tram went past this Daisy Nambour I used to take to town, and I went to school with some of the daughters. It wasn't far from the house, this tram line. The youngest son, he was only about 2 or 3, and she used to tie him to the leg of the table because he used to run out and sit on the tram line. And the tram used to pick up their cane and their cream and everything too. So she had to do that every day when the tram come along.
In 1926, a 4-year-old girl stepped on board a passenger carriage in Mapleton and took the ride of her life off the edge of the Perwillowen Range. The passenger carriage had waist-high wooden walls and a row of seats down each side, a galvanised iron roof and canvas blinds ready to roll down if it rained. In parts, the track was so steep every carriage brake had to be screwed down in an attempt to slow the descent. There was a switchback that only such a little engine as the Shay could have negotiated. But oh, the view! When they weren't driving through cathedral-like forests, they could see right to the coast and the sea beyond. It took 2 hours to travel the 18 kilometres to Nambour. She still talked about that ride at the age of 90. She was my mother. My grandfather was Jack O'Leary, and he was a railway man and a railway union man all of his life. He came out to Australia from Wales in 1911, and in 1912 went out to work on the Merry Valley line as a navvy. They decided to have a holiday, which they didn't do very often. So in 1926, Jack found out that there was a guest house in Mapleton called the Strongarra, and he remembered what it was like to be up in this area and wandering through the bush. And he knew that Mapleton was on the edge of the rainforest, and there were walks, there's the Mapleton Falls and all that sort of thing. So he convinced the family to come up here for a holiday. And that is when my mum was 4 in 1926. They stayed at the Strongarra, and then the owner of the guest house, Mr. Johnson, knew that Jack was a railway man, and he started to tell him about the Mapleton Tramway and the fact that they could actually go on rides down the range to Nambour. Mary, my grandmother, used to work in a hotel, the Royal George, at Nambour as a domestic, so it was the obvious thing to do, to entertain the 3 little kids and to spend some time on their holiday. So they hopped on the tram, which was my mother's first trip. And until the day she died, literally, when she was 90, she was still telling me about that fantastic trip on the cane tram. She said it was like a roller coaster ride at times.